There's a strange silence inside you every time you meet someone who feels meant for you. Not excitement, not peace, just that familiar pull in your chest. The one that doesn't feel like love, but like recognition. A recognition not of the person standing in front of you, but of something older, deeper, and far more dangerous. Something from your past that still has its hands around your heart. You think it's destiny. You think it's chemistry. You think it's the universe finally giving you someone who feels like home. But deep down, if you slow your breathing and actually listen to the truth rising from your unconscious, you'll feel something unsettling. They don't feel like home. They feel like a memory, a wound, a bruise you forgot you had, but your heart never did. This is the part no one tells you. You don't choose people. Your trauma does. And when your trauma chooses, it always picks the same kind of person. The one who reopens the exact wound you never healed. You blame fate. You blame God. You blame timing. But the truth is more psychological and far more painful. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's exactly what's happening inside you. You think you're falling in love, but really, you're falling back into the emotional pattern that shaped you long before you knew the meaning of love. Somewhere in your childhood, something broke quietly. Maybe you had to earn affection. Maybe you were criticized for wanting attention. Maybe you felt invisible unless you impressed people. Maybe love felt like walking on eggshells. Or maybe you spent years trying to get someone to stay, only to watch them drift away while calling it your fault. Whatever it was, that moment carved a deep cut inside you. And that cut became the blueprint for your future relationships. That's why, when someone healthy comes into your life, you don't feel drawn to them. They feel unfamiliar. They feel confusing. They feel wrong. Almost like your heart doesn't know how to breathe around peace. But when someone shows the same emotional patterns as the people who wounded you, when they're slightly distant, inconsistent, mysterious, or emotionally unavailable, your body reacts instantly. Not because they're meant for you, but because your trauma recognizes them. You don't fall in love with the person. You fall in love with the emotional environment they recreate. That's why you tolerate behaviors you swore you'd never accept again. That's why you feel addicted to someone who hurts you. That's why you keep hoping they'll suddenly show up different. Because you're not chasing them. You're chasing the version of yourself that will finally be good enough for someone like them to choose you. This is trauma reenactment. Your unconscious mind is trying to rewrite the past by picking someone who resembles your wound, hoping that this time it will end differently. But it never does. And when you look at them, you see intensity and passion. But Jung would say, what you're really seeing is projection. You're projecting the unmet needs, the abandoned parts, and the emotional hunger you've been carrying for years onto their face. They aren't destiny. They're a mirror, reflecting the exact place where you're still broken. You convince yourself that you're meant to be because the connection feels powerful. Of course it does. The nervous system feels powerful too when you're reliving an old trauma. Emotional chaos can feel like passion. Anxiety can feel like chemistry. Distance can feel like mystery. And unpredictability can feel like excitement. But none of this is love. It's just your past screaming through your present. And deep inside, you know it. You know this bond doesn't bring out your best self. You know it makes you insecure. You know it keeps you waiting for a version of them that only exists in your imagination. You know you stay because the pain feels familiar, not because the relationship feels safe. Every time you tell yourself, "They're meant for me," there is a quiet voice inside whispering, "No, they're just the shape of your wound." You ignore it because the truth is inconvenient. You don't want another heartbreak. You don't want to start over. And you don't want to face the reality that you're attached to someone who reflects a version of love you've known your whole life. The version that hurts. Your unconscious doesn't care about your happiness. It only cares about what feels familiar. That's why it drags you toward people who awaken the same emotions you felt as a child. Not because they're right for you, but because they make sense to your emotional history. They match the pattern. They match the wound. They match the story you've been telling yourself silently for years. Love is something I have to earn. Love is something I have to chase. Love is something that hurts. Love is something that leaves. And the scariest part is this: you mistake that emotional pattern for fate. You think the universe is sending you signs, but it's just your nervous system recognizing danger and confusing it with connection. It's your childhood ache rising to the surface and calling itself love. You look at them and think, "I don't know why, but I feel so drawn to them." But I'll tell you why. Because your wound sees its reflection in them. This is why you stay even when you shouldn't. This is why you feel responsible for fixing them. This is why you feel chosen even when they barely choose you. Your past is choosing for you, not your heart. Your heart wants safety. Your wound wants familiarity. And until you learn the difference, you'll keep calling the wrong person meant for me and the right person boring. But the truth is simple. Someone who feels like a lesson will never feel like a home. Someone who activates your wounds will never heal them. And someone who mirrors your past will never help you build your future. The person you think is meant for you is just the trauma that shaped you, wearing the face of someone you desperately want to understand. And the moment you stop romanticizing pain, you'll finally see the truth. Love wasn't supposed to hurt. You just learned it that way. There comes a moment in every painful connection, a moment you can't explain logically, when something inside you whispers, "I've been here before." It doesn't feel new. It feels remembered. The way they pull away when you become vulnerable. The way you feel anxious when they don't reply. The way you start overthinking your worth. The way you try to shrink your needs because you don't want to burden them. And the way you keep hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'll finally see the version of you that you're trying so hard to prove exists. This isn't love. This is reenactment. Your body is remembering the emotional landscape you grew up in, and the person you're attached to has become the perfect trigger for the unresolved story you're still trying to finish. Jung said that the people who stir our deepest emotions are usually those who carry pieces of our unconscious. That's why you can't detach easily, because you're not detaching from them. You're detaching from the narrative your wounded inner child never got to complete. You weren't drawn to them accidentally. You were drawn because something about the way they love, or fail to love, feels familiar. The inconsistency, the tension, the emotional distance, the unpredictability. These are not coincidences. They are psychological breadcrumbs that lead directly back to the person who first shaped your idea of love. Maybe it was a parent who was emotionally absent. Maybe it was someone who made you feel like your feelings were too much. Maybe it was someone who made you earn affection or made you feel responsible for their moods. Maybe it was a caretaker who never really cared. Your heart learned early that attachment is painful, that closeness doesn't last, that people leave, that you must perform to be accepted, that being loved means being useful, entertaining, impressive, or quiet. And now, years later, you choose partners who recreate that same emotional atmosphere, not because you want pain, but because pain is the language your heart was taught. You don't chase them because they're right for you. You chase them because your nervous system is convinced that winning their love will finally heal the childhood version of you who never felt chosen. This is the illusion. This is the trap. This is why the same kind of person keeps appearing in your life, wearing a different face, but carrying the same wound. And every time you think, this time it will be different. You believe your love will be enough to fix them, enough to change them, enough to make them finally give you the affection you've always deserved. But trauma bonds don't heal through repetition. They heal when you finally walk away from the cycle you were conditioned to call love. The hardest part of all this is admitting that the person who feels like home is actually the person who feels like your childhood. And your childhood wasn't safe. It wasn't emotionally stable. It wasn't nurturing in the way you needed. That's why your heart doesn't recognize real love when it appears. Real love doesn't match your wound. Real love doesn't activate your anxiety. Real love doesn't feel like a test you have to pass. That's why healthy people feel boring to you. It's not because they lack passion. It's because they lack chaos. They don't trigger your survival mode. They don't mirror your abandonment fears. They don't make you feel unsure of yourself. They don't make you chase, prove, or perform. They don't stimulate the parts of your nervous system that confuse danger with desire. And because they don't match your trauma pattern, your mind dismisses them. You tell yourself there's no spark, no chemistry, no connection. But the truth is more painful. There's no wound. When someone doesn't activate your pain, your unconscious doesn't know how to connect with them. It's unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliarity feels unsafe, even if it's actually the safest thing you've ever experienced. So you choose the person who feels like a storm, instead of the person who feels like stability. You choose the person who makes you anxious, instead of the person who gives you peace. You choose the person who mirrors your wounds, instead of the person who mirrors your worth. And every time you get hurt again, you blame yourself. You think something is wrong with you. You think you're unlovable. You think you're cursed with bad luck. You think you're just too much, or too emotional, or too difficult. But you're not cursed. You're conditioned. You're not unlovable. You're unhealed. And that unhealed part of you keeps picking the same story. Not because you deserve it, but because you're trying to rewrite a chapter that wasn't your fault. But here's the truth you've avoided. You cannot heal a childhood wound through an adult relationship. You cannot repair your past by choosing someone who repeats it. And you cannot save someone who represents the very pain you're trying to escape. You keep telling yourself that walking away means failure. But walking away is the first time you give your inner child something they never had: protection. When you finally step out of the cycle, you're not leaving them. You're leaving the version of yourself that thought pain was normal. You're leaving the belief that love must be earned. You're leaving the people who feel like wounds. You're leaving the story that taught you to settle for less than what your soul truly craves. It starts subtly. First, with honesty. The honesty to admit that the person who feels magnetic isn't meant for you. They're meant to reveal you. To reveal where you're still bleeding. To reveal where you're still afraid. To reveal what you're still carrying. To reveal the parts of yourself that you've abandoned. The day you stop calling them your destiny and start calling them your pattern is the day you begin to heal. The day you stop chasing them and start choosing yourself, your story changes. The day you stop romanticizing inconsistency, your heart finally breathes. You will realize that the people you've been calling soulmates were never soulmates. They were mirrors. They were messengers. They were reminders of what still needs healing. They were lessons disguised as lovers. And the moment you understand that, the spell breaks. The pull fades. The attachment loosens. And the truth becomes clear. You weren't in love with them. You were in love with who you hoped they would become. You were in love with the idea of finally being chosen by someone who resembles the person who couldn't choose you in the past. It wasn't love. It was unfinished business, dressed up as destiny. When you finally face your wound, you break the cycle. And for the first time in your life, your heart becomes free. Free to recognize real love. Free to choose peace. Free to choose safety. Free to choose someone who doesn't remind you of your trauma, but reminds you of your worth. And that's when the real healing begins. If this hits somewhere you've never been able to put into words, it's because you've lived it. And maybe for the first time, you finally understand why you keep choosing the same pain. If you want more clarity, more truth, and more psychological awakening, stay with me. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of this story felt like it was written about you.